we are starting the last panel of our conference, which is called Hegemony, Crisis, Imperialism, and Global Security. I will briefly introduce our speakers, and I would like to remind you that each speaker will have 15 minutes for his and her talk, and this will be followed by a Q&A session, which you can join by sending your questions to the chat, and I will read them. I will read them aloud so that our speakers can answer them. I would also like to remind our panelists that it's advisable to speak slowly because we have an interpreters working here, and yeah, that will make everyone's experience a bit better. So here today we have Taras Belows, who is a co-editor of Commons, our journal, and who has also been active in the debates among the left on numerous platforms. You can read his articles in Jacobin, in various other international publications, and his interventions concern the position that the international left takes on this war and the questions of global security and international coordination. Our second speaker is Gilbert Achcar, a professor of development studies and international relations from SOAS, University of London, and he will be talking about his talk is titled "For a Socialist Anti-Imperialist Conception of Global Security." The third panelist is Zofia Malisz from Razem, Poland, who is also an active member of the debate on the left about the Russian aggression in Ukraine. Her talk is called "Why the World Needs a Left Security Policy: A Look from the Eastern European Perspective." And last but not least, we have Ilya Matveev, a political scientist, a member, a researcher from Public Sociology Lab, and a contributor and editor of Posle.media, Russian anti-war platform, which also publishes in English, and also an active member of debate on Russian imperialism. His talk is titled "The Limits of Deglobalization: How Far Can the Formation of Political Economic Blocs Go?" I tell you, I remind you about the titles of these interventions because not all of they are not unfortunately in our program. So please be attuned to these topics and prepare your questions. And now we will start with Taras Belows. He asked to speak first because he has complications with his internet connection. Okay, no, I'm sorry. No, it turns out that Taras can't join us out now, unfortunately. I hope he will join us at the end of this hour. before the Q&A. So therefore, I would invite Gilbert to speak first. I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Okay, Volodya, thank you for the invitation, and I'm very glad to be part of this panel and actually of this the activities organized by Commons, which is a remarkable publication of great quality, judging from the English, of course. I can't read Ukrainian. Well, it's a nice opportunity to meet again some other fellow panelists here. Well, I thought that I would be speaking at the end because that's how it was presented, and my topic was therefore something looking at the future. But since now I'm asked to speak at the beginning, it's important, therefore, to address the immediate title of this panel. So, first of all, about the left position towards that. I mean, this has been discussed a lot, and I'm sure within this conference too, over the 2-3 days of this conference. And I apologize in advance, but of course I haven't attended the previous panels, and I couldn't attend anyhow, but especially not all of them. So there's a lot that may have been said about these issues. Anyway, I think that the principles for an anti-imperialist stance in world affairs and in issues like wars is pretty clear. We draw a distinction between legitimate wars, which are wars of national defense or of national liberation, right? And imperialist wars or colonialist wars or whatever, which are wars of oppression. That's a very basic distinction. That includes even the distinction between the nationalism of the oppressed and the nationalism of the oppressor, which is also a basic distinction, even though internationalists may be or are or should be, I mean, beyond any form of nationalism, including nationalism of the oppressed. But nevertheless, we draw a major distinction between nationalism of the oppressed, which is legitimate as long as it remains within the framework of fighting oppression, against oppression, for liberation, and nationalism of the oppressors, which by definition is oppressive and therefore something that should be fought against. And therefore, that's how we look at every war. And I mean, in this case, the debate that has existed, which shouldn't have existed, because I think the situation is so obvious that there shouldn't have been any debate, because you have an historical oppressor of Ukraine, Russia, the Russian Federation, but Russia in particular, its core, invading Ukraine with a very clear colonialist discourse. The discourse embodied the speeches of Vladimir Putin. And therefore, you have one country that is aggressed, that's Ukraine, that is fighting a war of self-defense, which is a legitimate war by any standard we take. And there is an aggressor country, an imperialist country, which is Russia, in the role of the aggressor. If there was any discussion among people belonging to the left internationally, and here I'm not counting those who believe that Putin is their model, anyone believing that Putin is the kind of or a regime that should be supported does not belong to the left. I mean, that's like having had, with all the distinction possibles, but with all the differences, but I mean, there are kinds of oppressors in history where if you support them, you can't be anything called left. So if you put aside this, the only discussion was about those who had such fixation with Western imperialism and US imperialism in particular, that they tended to portray the Russian move as almost as a defensive reaction against Western intrusion or Western encirclement of Russia. Some gave the kind of argument, about NATO expanding to the borders of Russia, explaining, so how would the United States react if Mexico became a basis for Russia or China or whatever, with the deployment of Chinese weapons. Well, that's an interesting argument, because if you take it to the end, well, let's suppose this happened and the United States invaded Mexico. What would they say? Would they say, well, the United States is reacting and the fault is Russia's? Or they would say, whatever Russia has done, or China, in putting weapons in Mexico, the aggression of the United States on Mexico is an imperialist aggression that should be repelled. And the same applies to Ukraine and the ongoing war. So I think the matter should be very clear in that regard, and any hesitation in that is actually in some way belittling the significance of the invasion, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is a major crime. Of course, there have been others. The United States did terrible things, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the list can be very long if we go to the whole Cold War period. But this does not mean that, or is no excuse or pretext to just take a different stance from what Russia is doing in turn. And Russia also has done a lot, whether in Afghanistan or Chechnya or Syria. Putin's Russia in particular has been an extremely aggressive country, which has been involved in very destructive wars as the Syrian tragedy. Now, beyond that, the issue that I wanted to address, and I will address in a very concentrated form, is what can be a socialist policy towards international relations. And I spoke of the attitudes towards war. Of course, anti-imperialism cannot be divided. So the real anti-imperialism is a rejection of all imperialist countries. And here you have a tradition, even the Russian revolutionaries during the First World War were quite clear with this small section of the left which stuck to an internationalist position in rejecting all imperialist countries. And therefore having a real anti-imperialist stance, which is against all imperialist countries, whichever they are. But beyond this issue of imperialism and war, how can we imagine a socialist policy towards international relations? Here we have again to distinguish between two things: utopia. I mean, of course, we can develop a utopia about what kind of world we dream of. A socialist world where maybe you would have a completely qualitatively different United Nations, much more powerful as the central organization of international relations, with different rules. Of course, no veto rights, no such things, maybe a second assembly, and besides the assembly of states, you could imagine an assembly elected by populations on the basis of representation of populations. So somewhat like you had in the Soviet Union kind of constitution. I mean, an assembly of states or of nations and one of populations. So you can imagine something like that at the global level. I mean, that was also the imagination of the revolutionaries after the Russian Revolution of 17, because even the name itself of the USSR was not a national name. So it was conceived as something that would extend to the whole world as a union of socialist Soviet republics. The term Soviet was not national term, as you know. Of course, you know more, even better than I, but it means councils. It refers to a form of organization of politics. Now, this is utopia. And what we need is to define what we can defend under the present conditions. And that's the key point. Here, I would say that the United Nations is an important historical achievement, which is a product of centuries, if you want, of history and terrible wars. And it took 2 world wars, very destructive, especially the second one, to lead to this kind of organization, which is definitely a major step forward in international relations, whatever limitations it has. It has limitations, it has flaws, but this is, in the present world, that defines the framework of international law. And I think socialists should defend the United Nations, the role of the United Nations, the UN Charter, and as a basis for international relations. That includes the also non-interference of states as states in the affairs of other states, because this is an important principle, in the sense that if you remove this principle, as is the case in the present world, what you have are powerful states intervening in the affairs of weak states or weaker states. You don't have any equality. That's why this principle of non-interference is actually more equal, more democratic. That's at the level of states, but that would also require that states do not also practice the double standards, which are very common, especially on the part of the United States and Western states. One should say they pretend to be following standards of democracy, freedom, and the rest, but they apply them in a completely uneven manner. They really practice not only double standard, but multiple standards in their relation with the rest of the world, and that's interpreted by the peoples of the world as hypocrisy, and rightly so. So this should be rejected, and a distinction drawn between states and popular movement. We are on the side of popular movement, we have on the side of political parties and all that. As political parties, as social movements, of course, we interfere in the affairs of the whole world. We should be built as internationalists and fight for freedom, equality, against oppression everywhere. But as popular movements, as social movements, and that's not the business of the states. And I will add and conclude by the great importance of fighting for disarmament. That was inscribed even in the UN Charter. There has been periodic attempts at putting disarmament on the table, but I think there should be an international campaign for disarmament. if you check online, you will find the appeal for disarmament by 50 Nobel Prize, 50 holders of the Nobel Prize in Sciences. They launch an appeal suggesting that the whole countries of the world, and that would be something organized by the United Nations, reduce by 2% every year their military expenditure. And that they calculated that over a few years, this would make, of course, a huge amount of money that can, at least part of which can be used in the fight against climate change and against pandemics, which are major threats facing humanity today. So I think this issue of disarmament, which we can find a first expression of in the workers' movement in Friedrich Engels, who wrote in the late 19th century a pamphlet calling the workers' movement to fight for disarmament with a vision that is similar somewhat to what I mentioned. I think this should again be a major component of the international policy of socialist movements.
Thank you, Gilbert. Thank you for delineating the possible lines of action for the internationalist left, and pointing to the fault lines that exist in the debate around this war, although, as you said, shouldn't exist. In fact, I decided to place your contribution first because, as I guess from the title, it speaks very well to the debates in the previous panels, roundtables that we had. One of the points of contention that emerged in the roundtable with the representatives of Ukrainian progressive volunteers was as follows. A German left-wing activist called Maximilian urged Ukrainian soldiers, actually he didn't urge, he demanded that Ukrainian soldiers should fraternize with the Russian soldiers on the front lines. And yeah, that was kind of contested as something utopian and unrealistic by the discussants on the Ukrainian side. And keeping in mind this weird questions that might arise, I think that what you pointed out, the distinction between strategic and utopian kind of vision and tactical medium term and medium scale steps that the left will take in, for example, supporting existing international institutions is extremely important. It's something that somehow lacks in the debate on the left. And what comes instead is a sort of clash between Western, a lot of the left that is situated in the core Western countries of the global capitalism and the so-called East, which reflects the global division of labor, but also reflects the global division of left of progressive knowledge production. And for some reason, the left in the core countries somehow tend to think that they monopolize the universalist, utopian, long-term perspective, while the left in the East tries hard to think about strategic, tactical, and medium-term perspective. But I think this is crucial and this is important because this brings us back to the roots of Marxism, to the type of thinking that Engels himself was exemplifying while dedicating a lot of his time to analyzing the minutiae of battles, of tactical moves of the German imperialism and Russian imperialism. And therefore, in focusing on these divisions and dimensions, I want to invite Zofia to talk about the perspective from the Eastern Europe.
Hi, my name is Zofia Malisz. I am from the Polish left party Razem, and I would really like to thank Spilne Commons for the invitation and to be able to take part in this very important panel with inspiring panelists and to finally be in the same, if only a remote space with Taras Bilus, hopefully in a few minutes, because we haven't met yet, but I really admire his work, both intellectual and on the ground, and in general, the editorial board of Spilne. You are doing a great job. And yeah, just wanted to thank you at the beginning. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the vacuum of security policy that has been created, that exists on the left, and why these vacuums, this vacuum that has been created is very dangerous and does a lot of damage. I think what Gilbert said at the beginning about the pacifist utopia is part of the initial frame that I also thought of introducing at the beginning. So let me start perhaps with the kind of a vacuum of vision on foreign and by extension security policy that we have on the left, particularly radical left right now. And why filling this vacuum is so very important, given that we live in times of the return of history, and particularly for our region, and by their region or our region, I mean Central Eastern Europe. Why coming at least temporarily in the short and the midterm away from, or at least in parallel engaging in constructing short-term, midterm visions that are not utopic and not militaristic is so very important for our security. So what is the big picture regarding left foreign and security policy? So what are the security conceptual frameworks that we are working with? So the ones that are proposed most often on the global left are unfortunately very abstract or extremely ideologized visions. This means that they are not very useful in cases when the sword falls and there is an armed conflict that had not been stopped by diplomatic solutions. And when a power uses armed conflict as part of its internal policy, such as the Russian Federation does, or in case of imperialistic and genocidal aggressions, with which we also have to do in Ukraine by Russia. So the extremely abstract solution that I mean that is only useful to a limited extent, particularly in the extent that Gilbert was talking about as a kind of a global, wider vision. However, in its forms that we have encountered in our existing dialogue and conversations with the Western left, what we usually are encountered with in terms of a vision for security is the from my point of view naive pacifism, as in we want peace, we do not want war, and we'd rather have not weapons around. And the other paradigm that we see very often is the, from my point of view, too ideologized paradigm of no NATO as a bloc and full stop, right? Just to be clear, as Gilbert says, as long-term solutions, peace, demilitarization, and no military blocs such as NATO and CSTO are definitely goals worth pursuing in the long term for the left. But these are not answers for today. I think what are more powerful arguments for today is are provided in the form of continuing to oppose the fossil industry and the military complex connected to it. And I will be talking about a kind of a program that for a defense, for a security vision that Razem proposes that comes from the left and has these components definitely as kind of a very important components of this vision. But for the here and now, in the short and mid-term, and this is the view from Eastern Europe, as long as the Russian imperialist threat exists, countries in Europe, such as Finland, Latvia, Poland, Romania, have the right to arm themselves or to demand from NATO to move arms onto their territory. And I think to demand an immediate dismantling of the alliance is, first of all, not realistic. It's ideologized, and it effectively overlooks the security interests of Baltic and regional states. That is all NATO states bordering Russia and by extension, of course, Ukraine. And this is the minimal political consensus post-invasion on which Eastern and Western European left perhaps not must agree, but at least start debating without prejudice in order to come together and fill some kind of a dialogue vacuum that is also existing. Such a dialogue on a larger scale is missing, and it kind of prevents building solidarity. So regarding replenishing arms in our region, as a national policy in NATO countries such as Poland, Slovakia, the Baltic states, Romania, and so on, after they had, for example, supplied Ukraine with their own stocks, is not a sign of supporting NATO imperialism or its aggressive engagement of China that is a possible future outcome of imperialistic ambitions of the US. So replenishing arms, unfortunately, is necessary in those countries in a phase when Putin and his surrogates directly threaten invasions and the nuclear annihilation to Warsaw or Vilnius. And you know, Razem has advocated and campaigned strongly to arm Ukraine, and it would also not be advisable to prevent, to basically deny the same to the neighbors from the former buffer zone, because this buffer zone still apparently remains in the interest of Russian oligarchic elites that wage the current war, if you believe at least what you hear in Russian media and so on. But more importantly, what I wanted to say is that if you say no NATO and so on, it's wrong in the sense that you cannot make such a generalizing, opposing the bloc in its entirety is kind of conflating local political realities. So the truth is that you cannot really state anything about the political situation of NATO member states that would apply to all of NATO as a bloc. So we have been for a long time trying to reason on the grounds of you have to consider what the political situation of particular member states is and propose alternatives to NATO and not just say simply no, and you should leave the alliance or demilitarize completely. So this debate or non-debate, because we at Razem and on the the left in Eastern Europe has not really gotten a comprehensive or even remotely comprehensive response from let's say the Western left to this question. If not NATO, then what? This unanswered question, this question has remained unanswered, and we started asking this question well before February this year. There are no proposals, and there have not been compelling proposals that we have heard, or compelling discussions on the left forums in which, for example, the security and the local political situation of Eastern Europe would take center stage. So how can we on the left guarantee the safety of our people and the people in the region in short and midterm before we or at the same time as we work towards this absolutely right global vision and demilitarization, denuclearization, as a kind of overarching set of principles. We are pretty realistic also at Razem that even NATO does not guarantee the safety of our people. This has to do with the transatlantic dimension, which has to be discussed by the member states. So we have been asking ourselves this pretty often: where would we and Ukraine be if the president of the USA was not Biden or Trump? This is also something that will face us very soon. But in general, we have been struggling with this view that it's either pacifism or militarism. And Razem wants to challenge this in the sense we want to propose an alternative for a left security policy that is neither an abstract, naive pacifism nor militaristic. We think that this is a false set of alternatives. And we haven't seen a better example of this, and actually a set of policies that could be taken on the national level as far as defense policy is concerned, than in the Nordic countries recently. So an absolutely correct general long-term pacifist stance of the left parties in Finland and Sweden was adjusted to the short-term political reality and the needs of the people. So the Finnish and Swedish left, of course, begrudgingly, but accepted that the security of the people is the responsibility of the state, and they had to accept the most immediate guarantee for the safety. So just to kind of, it's not an excuse for us, it's a reality that in places like Poland, Ukraine, and Nordics, the left simply cannot afford to disengage from programmatic defensive analysis in order to maintain opposing NATO imperialism as its sole focus, as it is the case very often on the Western left, particularly in countries that either are post-imperialist or still carry some imperialist policy forward. That would simply be irresponsible from a state responsibility point of view and to our voters. And we believe that it is possible to oppose NATO imperialism and as we have done, opposing the Iraq war, the engagement of the Polish army in Afghanistan, and so on, and to differentiate those local political situations, analyze locally, and assess the utility of the alliance for deterrence purposes in the short and midterm. But on the general left, as we sit here, there, and particularly on the part of the left and Western left that does not support Ukraine, there is this very kind of a dogmatic type of point of view that creates this vacuum of ideas regarding security. And it is dangerous because it creates a kind of a disengagement of the left and the discussion on the left, also in other very important parts of our policy. So, for example, with the intersection of military and economic imperialism and the kind of expansion of capital. So, so the left disengages from discussing, for example, with Razem, whom the global left might disengage from discussing security policy with Razem, judging us as a kind of a NATO militaristic left. And by doing that, it is opening yet another vacuum of alternatives and support, for example, in the economic part. So this is very dangerous, particularly for Ukraine, because this lack of support and the disengagement of the global left from discussing our security also kind of facilitates economic aggression, so to speak, of the capital in these other spaces where we do not look for solutions together. So this vacuum facilitates liberal extremist shock doctrines, and they can be implemented therefore more easily, for example, in the Ukraine. So where there is no left and no debate, no internationalist debate, where the left does not participate in the debate and cuts itself effectively out, it allows the capital to take over. And this is what happened in Poland in the early 90s. We did not have left alternatives for the transformation of the Western left and the radical left. And this is what may also happen in Ukraine if there is no dialogue established soon, and this understanding of the different political realities of security connected to it, if this is not created somehow, the spaces for the dialogue. So we need massive support in the shape of specific proposals about how the European and global community can forge a path to a social Ukraine and the safety of the region, because this is, of course, connected from Russian imperialism, and we need urgent and engaged action. So unless there is unequivocal support for the Ukrainian left, for example, and the trade unions that defines this path, unless we remove these vacuums of debate and visions, there will be a shock doctrine shaped neoliberal landscape there. And this applies to a crucial sector, which is the energy sector, obviously, as well, that I won't talk about. So what do we need in terms of this short-term, mid-term defense policy or security policy solution? So, as I said, we want to break with this false dichotomy that there is either pacifism or militarism. So that is Razem's policy, wants to break with this and propose a left security policy. So Razem treats the armed forces as a public service institution, and it fulfills the constitutional functions of the state, that is the defense of the citizens and to guarantee that the borders are intact. And the armed forces in this concept cannot realize its own interests, but need to be simply able to defend the citizens and the borders first and foremost, and only then be ready to support allies. And the armed forces in our proposal would be a kind of a citizens' army with a defensive character, with the main function and the main kind of role of these armed forces would be deterrence. And of course, this requires from the Polish armed forces, in our vision, if this is a public institution, that we demand of this public institution the same standards that we as Razem and the left would like to see in kind of social relations in Poland. That is, for example, we would like to regulate and include and guarantee the safety of women and LGBT people serving in the Polish army, which is, in terms of women, only to a limited extent there. And of course, our defense policy is against a progressive militarization of the society, or using the army to kind of in the service of right-wing propaganda. We have quite a lot of in our history, in the Polish history of the Polish armed forces, we can draw from very many traditions that show us, you know, the emancipatory and also socialist dimension, such as Tadeusz Kościuszko, our participation in the American Independence War, the Paris Commune, you know, standing on the side of the Republic in the Spanish Civil War, and so on. Another dimension to our vision of a kind of a left program for defense is limiting military budgets to 2% at most, because, you know, military budgets are not an invitation to kind of become a lobbyist playground, or to stimulate growth the way, for example, the US is doing. Okay, so this is kind of an excerpt of what a left defense vision in a specific political situation of Eastern Europe would look like, that Razem is proposing. Other proposals that I can talk about later, perhaps in the Q&A, is our ideas for at least a vision of a European army and complementary alliances that we propose as one of our main parts of the policy, which is that we would like to see military economic alliances also in the region, for example, in the Baltic region, working towards a European alliance in a kind of an attempt to, given our skepticism regarding transatlantic relations, to kind of work on complementary alliances that would go beyond, or, you know, even do away with NATO. Yeah, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Zofia, for a very clear and organized presentation of this tactical vision of the transformation of actually building up of a realistic security discourse on the left. And what you said, that there is a consensus about the need to talk about issues of security on the left, and that this is something that is not being discussed, is a symptom, in my opinion, of precipitating decline of what we know as the American hegemony in the last 30 years, and stretching back to the end of the Second World War. You see that this cracks in hegemony when the issues of domination, of crude force domination, raises to the surface, and it is visible in the peripheries of the hegemony in this what Borrell called the jungles on the edges of the jungle. And these cracks are perceived differently, of course, in the core, where the left is used to fight the world where American neoliberal American-led neoliberal globalization is the main enemy, while we see a new world emerging. And here I would invite Ilya Matveev to talk about the transformation of this world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and to be able to present my observations. So I would begin with a point that the topic of this panel is global security, and obviously global security is under threat today. This threat is perhaps unprecedented in recent decades, and the biggest immediate threat is Russia's nuclear threats and the possibility of further escalation of Russia's murderous war in Ukraine. But I think that there is a deeper and structural process going on, because otherwise we could imagine the situation where Russia is defeated militarily, and then there is some kind of political change in Russia, and the world security can go back to some kind of normality. But unfortunately, I suspect that this is not possible, precisely because of this underlying structural process that is going on in the world. So consider the following facts in Chinese-American relations. First of all, this year, the United States ended its policy of so-called strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan, and American administration basically declared that the United States will intervene in case of war in Taiwan, and this is a huge policy shift for America. And then the second thing that happens recently is that the United States declared restrictions on exports of latest generation microchips to China, of equipment for the production of these microchips, and a unique policy of forcing American employees in this Chinese microchip industry that they have to choose between their American citizenship or green cards and their continued work in Chinese microchip industry. So they either continue working there and they lose citizenship, or they go back and maintain their citizenship. So this is also rather unprecedented, and this indicates that for the United States, it's a decided issue that now the policy is to try and prevent China's technological and economic rise, because this rise itself is threatening American and global security. This is how America sees it. So these are not isolated facts. We also see events like China trying to carry out a stress test, a so-called stress test of potential sanctions by the West against China that would be similar to sanctions against Russia. And many Chinese companies exit from their American investments because they fear that these investments and these assets could be frozen by the United States government. We also see that foreign investors are exiting China. So there is a kind of process of decoupling already going on, economic decoupling. Then we see United States Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen supporting so-called friendshoring, meaning locating supply chains within Western geopolitical space and severing economic relations with China. So this is a policy that is increasingly defended in American intellectual circles. So the point is that globalization is basically over, and we need to create a kind of trade bloc that will include politically friendly countries, and we need to sever economic ties to a large extent, sever economic ties to unfriendly countries, and primarily China. So the director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, actually pointed out that this is a possibility. She said that this double crisis, pandemic and war, and our ability to deal with them are further complicated by another growing risk: fragmentation of the world economy into geopolitical blocs. So we see that this is a real objective process that is going on, the formation of these geopolitical and geo-economic blocs. So in a recent paper, Branko Milanovic wrote that nowadays this is called friendshoring, but in reality, this is trade blocs that we know very well from world's history. And trade blocs dominated global trade up until the Second World War. So this is not some kind of new thing. And for Milanovic, this string of publications that advocate this severing of economic ties between America and China, so they sort of ignore all this history that the world had with the trade blocs in the past. And we can go even further, and we can ask the following question. So we know that previously this kind of geopolitical and geoeconomic blocs and inter-imperialist rivalries led to two global wars. So the First World War and the Second World War. So what would be different this time? So are there any countervailing forces to this growing tension between those emerging political and economic blocs? So can we expect better relations between them, or we can expect gradually worsening relations between the West, between China, Russia, that will either try to form its own political economic bloc, or more likely will join China as a subordinate partner, as an ally that is actually a junior partner in this bloc. So potentially this could result again in this growing inter-imperialist rivalries and global tensions that could even result into some kind of global escalation. So this is one thing to think about. There is also a kind of a paradox in this situation, because the left previously advocated against free trade, against international institutions such as such as the WTO, and the idea was that free trade on the global scale is an imperialist policy that is pushed forward by the United States primarily, and then there is a real alternative to free trade as a policy on the global scale, and it looks like this alternative becomes the mainstream. So this kind of neo-mercantilist approach to trade becomes mainstream. But the question is it in any way better than the previous free trade policy? So this emergence of political economic blocs and trade and supply chains located within these blocs, severing of economic ties between the blocs and trade wars between the blocs. So is it in any way better? Because previously there could be an argument that economic interdependence limits the potential for global conflicts. But if this economic interdependence is gradually eroded, so what prevents this new global conflict from emerging? So this is the big question that I want to ask in this presentation. The title of my talk refers to limits to this potential emergence of political and economic blocs. And I think that there are obviously very serious limits, because China and Western countries, of course, still have trillions of dollars in trade, and this will not be possible to quickly limit this trade between these countries. And there is also pushback by some Western leaders. So, for instance, Olaf Scholz recently noted that this idea of limiting supply chains only to geopolitically friendly countries is actually, so he does not support this policy. So there are limits, obviously, to this process. But my kind of concern is that it can start, and then it can have this self-propelling quality. So at first it goes on slowly. The volume of trade between these blocks is being reduced slowly, and then suddenly there is a kind of this moment when there is a complete severing of economic ties, and then nothing prevents the world from plunging into a global conflict. So I think this is an important question for the global left to think through, not just regional security policy, because I think that Zofia's remarks were extremely interesting and actually useful to me. So they extended my understanding of how we need to think about this on the regional level. But I think this needs to be extended into the global level. And we need to think about kind of global security policy for the left that takes into consideration this idea of new mercantilism, the emergence of new political economic blocs, and potential conflict between these blocs. So this is what I wanted to say today. Thanks.
Thank you, Ilya. That's a great reminder that we need to think not only in medium-term and tactical programs, but also to transform our internationalist perspective according to the new and emerging realities. We need to be ready for this, not least to make the terms of our debates within the left clearer, if not friendlier, then at least more productive. It has been, I have to note this, it has been a pity that in many events, conferences, roundtables that I attended, we had a conspicuous lack of speakers from China, from Vietnam, from Southeast Asia in general, which is frankly surprising. Even if it was a more regional, so-called post-socialist or post-Soviet events, we had this very narrow focus on either just Russia or Ukraine or Eastern Europe, and yeah, we have this glaring lack, which it seems needs an urgent corrective. I do not think I do not see Taras anywhere in Zoom or on Facebook. Could you please, Sasha or Oksana, could you please tell me whether you have any contact?
He is not available now. And
okay. So it seems that Taras is not available, and I don't think that that we have a reasonable idea whether he will be soon. So I would suggest moving to the Q&A session, and in case Taras joins, he will be able to briefly, I think, comment on the points that our discussants made. So far we have, yes, and I would like to address the audience again that you can ask questions here in the chat for those who are present in Zoom, or in the comment section under the streaming, our Facebook streaming. Please do it. I will read your comments and will allow our guests to answer. I think we will jump immediately to the comments that we have already, because there are quite a few of them, and unless they are addressed to one particular guest, one of our guests, any of you can answer. So the first one comes from Natalka. She says that she's very interested in the points that Gilbert made. I'm sorry, Gilbert or Gilbert?
As you wish, no problem.
Yeah, okay. That Gilbert made. She says that she would like to add a small note on Gilbert's remarks on utopia, in case this is of interest. He says that she attended a lecture series on utopia in Columbia Center for Critical Thought, and she says that utopia can be used as an instrument in transformative politics if we conceive of it as a procedure that examines the present, in quotation marks, for potential emancipatory practices and breakthroughs in state modes of discourse. Utopia can be a very useful tool for critique of the bad kinds of realism, which can be just another word for conservatism. Yeah, I think the point of the sort of weird convergence between, that's already my commentary, weird convergence between the purest left and the most conservative views of global of international politics, reflected in fascination that many on the left have with Mearsheimer's realism. So yeah, in this sense, the so-called pure left that only sees the world through the lens of the eventual class struggle that leads to revolution is in a weird way tactically aligned with conservatism. And yeah, maybe if you have any responses to these comments on utopia or various utopias, I would be and its critical potential, I would be grateful to hear.
Are you expecting me? No, I don't think it was a question. It was more just a way of telling people about this series of lectures organized by Columbia and the rest. But if you allow me, Volodya, I mean, I think we should be able also to respond to each other, to discuss between each other on the panel. So I would like to
please.
Okay, thank you. Two things. One about Ilya's presentation. I think that the idea that free trade and economic interdependence prevent wars is a liberal idea, which is wrong, historically, factually wrong. I mean, the First World War came at the end or the peak of the first wave of globalization. And there was a major increase in economic interdependence between countries. What we call globalization today produced the ongoing situation, which is a war situation, a global war situation. So free trade is just a recipe for the organization of free war between various capitals, supposedly without interference of the state. But this is a capitalist utopia, because at the end, always the state will side with its own local capital, and we have seen that throughout history. So I think we should be clear, and I'm sure you are, but just to make that point clearer, that we don't subscribe to this idea that free trade is the path to peace. It is not. And actually, we think that countries should be able to put their own development, their social development, especially, their social human development in the best meaning of the term, as the guiding principle of their economic policies. As for Zofia and the issue of NATO, I think I understand that under the present condition today, in a country like Poland, Razem cannot come and say, we demand the withdrawal of Poland from NATO, right? That would be extremely unpopular anyway, but that would, I mean, to explain that would be very, very difficult. However, we have to look at the things historically. First of all, the left was, and rightly was, but for the dissolution of NATO at the moment when the Soviet Union collapsed. And that was important to do that at that point. And the United States decided completely otherwise, into not only maintaining NATO, but changing the nature of NATO, both from the point of view of the function of NATO. And you remark that NATO never engaged in war during the whole time of the Soviet Union or the Cold War. And it's only after the Cold War that NATO started intervening in wars, in the Balkans, then Afghanistan, some intervention in Iraq, Libya, etc. So there has been a shift in the nature of NATO, going along with the expansion of NATO. These are policies that are, to a large extent, responsible for having created the kind of world in which we are. And saying this is by no means any excuse for Vladimir Putin, but it is an observation of the fact that Vladimir Putin himself is the result and the product of certain type of policies that were undertaken at the global level. And the second point is that even if you can't, of course, and I understand, call for Polish withdrawal from NATO, you should, and you already do it, as you explained, be against the non-defensive transformation of NATO. That is like sending Polish troops to Iraq or Afghanistan, as happened. You should be against that, and you are against that, very rightly so. So you're not just having a blank, abstract position of we remain in NATO. No, you have to explain that, and therefore the issue is we are for the dissolution of NATO in the framework of a global disarmament and the global dissolution of all. So that's the kind of goal, middle term, mid-term, long-term goal that we are fighting for, even if we understand that you can't tell the Polish people who feel threatened by Russian imperialism that they should get out of NATO at this point. And if any so-called anti-imperialists, who are only anti-Western imperialists, as we know, object to that, well, would they object to the fact that Egypt was armed, completely trained, and all that by the Soviet Union when it was fighting Israel? It was threatened by Israel. They would not object to that, so they cannot object to Polish armament and Polish desire for protection. That should be, however, for the preservation of peace and not for any wars. The key, the major goal remaining that of disarmament and real observation of the international law and the UN Charter.
Thank you. I will give an opportunity to respond to Ilya and Zofia. Please, you may also use this time to reflect on what was said previously and to ask your questions to the others too. Please, Ilya.
Right. So I agree with Gilbert completely that free trade is not an ideal in any sense, of course, for the left, and it is not a guarantee for lack of military conflicts. But what I wanted to point out is this alarming tendency that we see, that maybe it's the destiny of kind of free trade regimes to ultimately result in this division of the world. And at this point, we see already this second kind of division of the world, this new imperialist division of the world, and this looks quite scary, because we know from history what happens after the world is divided into these blocks. But of course, yeah, like I don't agree with this liberal line that if only everyone traded with everyone, then we will never have wars. So it's true, because we still have them, and this is what we see at the moment. Yeah.
Zofia.
Thank you, Gilbert, for the remarks. I would disagree. The way I understand, I would disagree with one point. I agree with all of the things you said, and I will come on to Razem's policy on kind of, NATO aggression and imperialistic impulses after the Cold War, but I'm not sure I understand this this claim that somehow NATO's expansion, particularly in Eastern Europe, or the current NATO flank, somehow created the conditions. I think, or I agree only. No, I actually would say that it's rather the escapades, half imperialistic and definitely not agreeing with international law that NATO has given like a blank check to Putin to do what he's doing right now. That's definitely so, but I do not understand yet the connection how NATO expansion emboldened NATO to do these breaches. Exactly. Particularly that, the behavior of the alliance on the eastern flank after Poland and other countries joined has been extremely careful vis-a-vis Russia, right? This, again, is a testament to, in the sense, I hope agrees with this call that, we should not judge everything en bloc and have a look at the political reality. So, so the kind of the will of escalation on the Eastern European flank of NATO has always actually been on Russia's part. And it's kind of Russia that came up closer to our borders than the other way around. So this kind of encirclement idea is actually a smokescreen, I think. And every single step of accession of a Central European country into the pact was followed by very careful measures, regarding military presence that. Not in order not to provoke Russia. So, for example, before 2014, there were no American troops on Polish soil, and definitely there are no nuclear weapons, and probably there won't be any there, and so on. So, but I'm sure we can discuss the NATO expansion aspect for a very long time. What I wanted to say is as a second part of my response is that we are at Razem worried very much about this Pacific pivot of the United States and these irresponsible behavior of some of Donald Trump and perhaps the future Republican president, I don't know, Marco Rubio or whoever is going to be. So this guarantee, this convenient, even though not comfortable, guarantee of the stability of NATO and the security in the region is kind of right now not warranted and troubling. We have had an absolutely unequivocal negative judgment of the Polish participation in the American occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, and particularly those arguments that were made in favor of this participation, that were made by the Polish governments and Polish politicians, that this is going to result in some contracts to rebuild and to extract fossil fuels. These are things that are absolutely, go counter to every value that Razem has, and we are against any imperialistic war under the Polish banner, or So as a rule, we think that that the armed forces that we propose should only take part in kind of peace missions, UN peace missions and humanitarian missions, and they should be all sorts of engagement. Even if you have a UN mandate is not enough, because there should be any kind of extraterrestrial use of the Polish forces should be confirmed by the parliament, and this links to what Catherine's summary was saying, that we should have more democratic control over armed forces in general, so that we do not have situations such as the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, single-handedly sends F-16s to Syria. This is absolutely unacceptable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think, Gilbert, you can very briefly respond to the question about NATO, the relation between NATO expansion and its more aggressive behavior.
Yeah, well, thank you, Volodya. Thank you, Zofia. But I understand where you're coming from. I can easily put myself in your shoes and understand how someone in Poland may see that. But allow someone from the Middle East, as I am, to look at things differently and look at things at the global level and see how Russia can feel towards the United States. Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and at the time when the United States was claiming that it would, be building a new world order, respecting international law, defending the weak against the strong, and all that. All this proved, excuse me for the term, but total bullshit, right? That started with the wars in the Balkans, the Kosovo War, which is something that could have been avoided, first war of NATO, right? And for Russia, that was that was seen as something very aggressive and a real breach in the promises of a different world. Then you had not long after that, 3-4 years after that, the invasion of Iraq by completely circumventing the United Nations Security Council and the rest. And you have these rounds of expansion. You have George W. Bush scrapping the anti-ballistic missile treaty. So you have a lot of gestures by the United States in which the expansion of NATO was full part, which meant the extension of the US empire regarding Russia as a potential rival. And this is definitely something that fostered, that stoked in Russia nationalism. Nationalism that was exploited by Putin. Putin came as a result of that, as a result of the weakness of Yeltsin in the front of the United States, this impotence of Yeltsin facing the United States, that led to Vladimir Putin and the catastrophe that we have been seeing. And even when Putin came, he even at some point tried to join NATO, and he understood, and they told him it's not for Russia. Clearly. So how do you want Russia to interpret all that? And then he gets into his Vladimir Putin thuggish, completely thuggish methods. So to block Georgia from joining, I invade part of Georgia, Abkhazia, and I don't know what. To block Ukraine from joining, I annexate Crimea and entered in eastern Ukraine. These are thuggish gangster methods, no doubt, but we have to understand also that on the other end, there is a gangster, a big gangster, much bigger actually, much more powerful, and that is the United States and Western European countries, and now Eastern European countries are acting as vassals of the United States. So that's
I agree with you.
yeah,
Can I?
that's part
So
of-
so
of
do
what
I
we- yeah, of
do I
what we
understand
should get
you?
rid of.
Do I understand you correctly that the participation of Eastern European countries that joined the alliance, the participation in these illegal invasions, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan, created this situation where Putin was, in that sense, that Eastern European expansion of NATO has created Putin the way we have it now. If you mean that, I absolutely agree. These were major mistakes by the Polish government to kind of get enthusiastic, to feel like now we are part of a bigger, it's an imperialist impulse. This is an imperialist impulse that has to be by us, Razem. Really, we are probably the only political power on the left in Poland, which is simply disgusted by this kind of vassal-like attitude of many Polish governments, be it on the nominal left, on the right, or the right, kind of paying tribute every time there is an American politician coming. This is not good, and it leads to such situations and is endangering our security and everybody else's, as you rightly stated. So this is not acceptable, and in that sense, I agree your point, and I agree with your point. Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting exchange. I would, before honoring our audience and getting back to their questions, I would actually address Ilya on this point, because it seemed to me that of course, whereas we object to NATO expansion as the immediate cause of the war of Russia's invasion, but in long-term perspective as a structural cause, it is quite valid. And now we can see that Russia, how Russia frames its own actions, how even this Russian speakers modulate their messages. A lot of it it's some sort of mimetic mimesis of NATO and US behavior in a way. Could you maybe comment on this a bit? Because you wrote a lot about Russian imperialism.
Well, I can just agree that it's never been in the nature of Putin's regime to provide any kind of alternative to NATO, for instance, or any kind of security alternative to the world, because it has been some kind of one-sided criticism, but then this constant desire to reproduce what the West is doing. And in fact, this desire is something like pathological, that they, on the one hand, criticize the West all the time. On the other hand, there is really this wish to show everyone that Russia is capable of doing the same. So it's true that in many ways, Putin is mirroring NATO in particular. So we know that, for instance, this thing pointed by Ivan Krastev, that Putin's speech after the annexation of Crimea had parts of Kosovo Declaration of Independence just reproduced, so this is the kind of perverse kind of logic that Putin has. It's true. And this is, and he is actually so open about this, about the fact that he has no desire to produce any kind of alternative. He just wants to do exactly the same thing, but in his own backyard, let's say, right? And so this is one of the things that makes it very strange that the left anywhere still thinks that Russia can play any kind of progressive role because it is fighting NATO, but it's just a kind of another imperialist power fighting NATO, and Putin is perfectly open himself about that. And then, as some tanky leftists say, it's dialectics that say, yes, there are two imperialists, but this is dialectics. But obviously, this is not how dialectics works. But yes, I agree with your original point. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have a duty to our audience to also react to their questions. So we have a question from Rachel Atwood, and it concerns. So she asks, will Sweden's new right-leaning administration change its approach to NATO and support for Ukraine? in any major ways from the previous government, if anyone knows? And moreover, will they scale back on accepting refugees from Ukraine and other conflict zones? Does anyone want to respond? You are mute, Gilbert. You are mute.
I'm just saying that none of us can speak about Sweden and Finland, I presume. I mean, unless someone has a special knowledge about it, but none of us is, to my knowledge.
No, okay. If nobody wants, then we'll. Okay. Someone responded actually in the chat. Yeah, please pay attention to the chat. There is some kind of parallel discussion, which I won't read all of it. And please, those who are on Facebook, leave your questions in the comments. We have rather a comment from Catherine's summary, I guess, to Zofia. You can I think you can just read it because it's a long comment. Then we have a question from Lev Turesenko. He asks, can limiting the sovereignty of nation states help by transferring part of it to international intergovernmental organizations to ensure global peace and international security? And yeah, that's it. I think, yeah, Gilbert.
Excuse me?
That was a question to Gilbert, and that's a broad question of whether limiting the sovereignty of nation states can help by transferring part of it, the sovereignty, to international intergovernmental organizations.
No, I mean, I don't think that this can be done, because again, this cannot work in the real world except as very unevenly to the advantage of the major powers and disadvantage of the small countries and weaker countries. That's why I said the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of states by other states. Again, I drew a very clear distinction between states and social movements, political parties, and all that. That's different. But as states, I think it's important. Now, nevertheless, the UN itself put some limitation to that with the responsibility to protect resolution. Responsibility to protect is like the rest of the interventions provided for by the UN Charter. It depends on a decision of the Security Council. In the Security Council, of course, for action, you need unanimity or at least non-objection from the 5 permanent members, right? Because they have veto rights. So if they vote against, it cannot work. If they abstain or vote for, it can work. So it depends. So this issue of the veto right is a legacy of the Second World War. It's based on relations of power. It's an expression of the kind of relation of powers you had. And it also translates in the fact that these are the 5 countries are the major nuclear powers anyway. So whatever limitations there are to this, that's how it exists. Now, so that means that at least there is some opening for intervention in the case of crimes against humanity. But as we know, as it works today, unfortunately, there is very little room for consensus among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So what remains here? What remains is that in case of wars, first of all, I think when a country breaches international law, like Russia did in invading Ukraine, it is perfectly legitimate for other countries to send weapons to Ukraine. that is a support for Ukraine's right to self-defense. And that's why, as a socialist, we should not oppose the arming of Ukraine. On the contrary, I'm not saying that we should argue for more arming, no, but at the very least, we cannot oppose that. I mean, this is legitimate and should be done. Otherwise, Ukraine would have been completely just subjugated by Russian imperialism. This, in the same way, if you have a civil war in a country with a government using, committing major crimes against humanity, I think it's perfectly also legitimate to demand the arming of those who are fighting oppression, right? So who objected to the arming of the Kurdish by the United States, the Kurdish movement, against ISIS, against the Islamic State and other such oppressors? These are situations where I mean, you can transgress an abstract vision of sovereignty when a state is divided, when you have a situation of war and the rest. So these are the parameters, I think, within which we can work, and these are the parameters, I think, that should guide a socialist policy on international relations.
Thank you. Now we have two rather broad questions. Okay, that comes from our Facebook. How can we as the left react to increasingly more dangerous and wartime world and push for demilitarization in this situation? Keeping in mind research and production period of modern weapons, time needed to produce them, etc. And what the way, what is the way in the short term and medium term to ensure international security while pursuing demilitarization in our countries? Because realistically, bilateral demilitarization of authoritarian and democratic countries is impossible now. Without US astonishing research and development for weapons and their Land-Lease Act, war in Ukraine could go in absolutely other directions, as European weapons supplies absolutely is not enough. How to answer to these increasingly dangerous conflicts? So I think that that's the dilemma of demilitarization in the conditions of war. I think Zofia alluded to that.
You asked Zofia to speak, no?
Yeah, I think I would invite her because she alluded to that, to these two demands of the military. Yeah, Zofia, please.
I alluded to
The simultaneous claim, simultaneous need for demilitarization and reinforcement of military component of security.
Well, what I was calling for is, first of all, not to go into this kind of dogmatic rejection of the discussion of security frameworks and how sometimes we need to militarize in the short or midterm, responding to exactly imperialist aggression, or participating in a as a side in a just war, or even fulfilling this public service kind of mandate of humanitarian or peace missions. What I meant, I guess, is that we cannot kind of dismiss the political situation on the ground with a blank statement that there should be no weapons and we should demilitarize ourselves. So yes, I am for simultaneous kind of paying attention, like for example this proposal to limit military budgets, paying attention to this overarching principle that we shouldn't first of all give a window of opportunity for the military industrial complex lobbying with washing the weapons market with cash. This is one thing we should have in our sights, and of course do not allow for a militarization of the society by somehow giving also too much kind of independence to the military elites or the structures. This should all be under democratic control as much as possible. But my general call was we need to start talking about how to do that, having on the left and also on the radical left, and keep in mind these different scales at which we operate. And not try to ignore one of those, because as the story of Eastern Europe and the Nordics and so on shows, it's just simply not possible. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question from the same author, I think it's addressed to Gilbert. That's Vlad. He asks, what would have been an alternative to NATO after the collapse of the USSR? Since you alluded to that the NATO should have been dismantled, because we know that Russia attacked Achcar in '94 and used military to destroy its opposition in '93, which is, of course raises legitimate questions about the security of bordering countries. So in other words, the question is like this. If you say that NATO should have been disbanded in '91, how should the world have been, I don't know, defending itself against Russia's aggressive acts in the '90s? That, I think, was the point.
Well, first, let me comment on the previous question. All the US aid to Ukraine is a very tiny fraction of US military expenditure. So the belief that the United States needs to increase its military expenditure in order to help Ukraine is not very serious, I would say. The United States far outspends the rest of the world, not only Russia, the whole rest of the world militarily. And the result of that, don't look at things through the angle of Ukraine alone, okay? You have other countries on the planet. Iraq has been destroyed to a far larger extent than Ukraine has been, right? By US imperialism. In 1991, precisely, and this question about the 90s and Russia, whatever Russia has done in the 90s is very small compared to the destruction of Iraq in '91 by the United States, followed a few years later by the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And in between 91 and 2003, Iraq, after having been destroyed in a way that today Russian bombing of Ukraine starts resembling, the United States destroyed the whole infrastructure of Iraq in '91. That's what Russia is trying to do in Ukraine today. And then the United States imposed an embargo on Iraq from '91 to 2003. According to the UN agencies and UNICEF, this led to the difference in mortality of 90,000 people per year, including 50,000 or 55,000 children, 50,000 children under the age of 5, which were victims of this embargo combined with destruction of infrastructure. So over 12 years, 90,000 people dying every year out of that. That is more than 1 million being killed by the action of US imperialism. So please get back to reality and look at the world as it is, not only through the angle of Eastern Europe. You have to take a global perspective. That's why we are socialists and we are internationalists. That's what socialism means, and that's why we are against all imperialisms. And we can't belittle the fact that the United States is the largest and the most thuggish imperialism in the world. Of course, as I said this, repeatedly, Putin is a total murderer, he's a criminal, he's a thug, everything you want. But he is, as Ilya pointed, when he does that, he says, well, I'm doing like you. All his speeches are exactly making that argument. What I'm doing is exactly what the United States have been doing. He just quotes the United States. He says, look what you are doing, so don't give me lessons. Don't teach me lessons. Look at yourselves. I'm doing what you are doing. So this is not to excuse Putin. That's absolutely zero excuse to Putin. In the same way that if the United States said the same, we would say, so we have to remain as socialist internationalists, anti-imperialist, against all imperialism, Western be they or Russian, or if China gets into invasive war, we would have we should have the same attitude. So that's the meaning here. So when the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union were dissolved, you had a request, you had an alternative to NATO, which was the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And the Russian side was asking for how to say, an upgrade of the role of the OSCE, which is pan-European, all European countries, East and West, the former Soviet Union republics to Spain and to the Atlantic shore. And this should have been the major security organization in Europe, and alongside the United Nations for the global policies. So these policies should have been pursued vigorously by the left, but the left didn't have a real program and a real conception of international relations. Here and there you had such positions, but they were not really put forward. So there were alternatives. Another world was possible, and another world is possible today. And we have to be very clear about that. That's our role as socialists. Not to say, oh, that's the only choice or the only game in town. No, we have to fight for something else. And when we speak of disarmament, this is coordinated disarmament, not unilateral disarmament. When Engels wrote his pamphlet, Friedrich Engels, Marx's companion, he was not advocating that in each country you have to fight for unilateral disarmament. That's not what he was saying. He was saying the workers' movement should put forward a program for the global work, for the international workers' movement, to fight for the simultaneous disarmament of all countries. That's what the Nobel Peace Prize winners have been advocating, a coordinated reduction of all military budgets. You know, the major threat facing humanity today is climate change. And the amounts that are spent on weapons and on the military are far superior to anything that the states are putting to fight against climate change, which is a much bigger threat than anything else. That's the key point we have to keep in mind, not to mention the fact that the military is a major polluter. The military itself is a major polluter, even without war. And of course, when you add war, look at Ukraine. The environmental damage caused by Russia in Ukraine by this war is certainly more than several decades of industrial pollution. It is terrible. And we have also to keep that in mind very much as socialists.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Gilbert wrote an article about Engels as a military thinker, as a strategist, and I would very much advise everyone to check it, because I think it's one of the topical kind of elements of the Marxist thinking that we keep forgetting. We have many questions, and we have little time, so let's move on. We have a question to Zofia. From Artem, would the format of international conferences similar to that of Rammstein, where different nations gather to discuss needed support and to provide such support to the countries under the threat, already fighting the imperialist threat, be a fair and righteous replacement to NATO? Would Rammstein be a replacement to NATO?
I would widen this question to the other panelists. I think, of course, it is a positive phenomenon, and it's within NATO, I guess, that this is happening. That in this context of supporting Ukraine in defending itself against the imperialist aggression with kind of neo-fascist and genocidal traits, and so I'm not sure whether this Rammstein format is being right now kind of presenting itself as an alternative, because it is engaged in supporting an anti-imperialist effort, and it just looks like that, or whether it would be a good general principle apart from the general idea that it's good for nations to try and work on a solution together and so on. On the other hand, those nations that discuss in Rammstein are, apart from the Ukrainian side, Western affluent nations that basically have very large expenditures and industries, weapon industries. So I'm not sure if this is the good example to replace NATO, but I would like to ask my co-panelists that as well. What would be a fair and righteous replacement?
Excuse me.
I would invite you to respond to Zofia's question.
Maybe Ilya first, because I've spoken a lot.
Yes, Ilya.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question. I only heard.
So Zofia finished her answer by addressing it essentially to both of you. What would be the fair alternative to NATO?
Mm-hmm. So I think Zofia said in the beginning of her presentation that there's a need for these kinds of proposals, but I don't think that we can immediately fulfill this need. What is the alternative to NATO? But I would say that, for instance, can this kind of meeting of countries to supply one country with weapons, can it replace NATO? I mean, realistically, no. Because NATO is not just a formal alliance, it's also a system of weapons, of standards, of all kinds of military standards that is needed to increase military capacity of each country. So it's not just that the countries meet, at a NATO summit and that's it. It's also a huge amount of hidden work. So I don't think that we can really replace NATO with, if we seriously talk about NATO as a defensive alliance that can help in situations like the Russian one, then unfortunately these kinds of meetings probably won't allow to replace NATO. But I think that's like ultimately there could be something else, maybe some new alliance that would be for instance, in its charter, be even more clear on, excluding wars of aggression and so-called wars of choice, so that situations like Serbia and Afghanistan cannot be repeated, something like this. But NATO is, I mean, this is the difficulty of talking about security policy from a leftist perspective, because then we need to go into all those, let's say, dirty details that the left kind of refuses to even engage with. The combat effectiveness of troops, for instance, because if we think about the capacity to defend itself for the countries, the capacity to defend themselves, then we need to think about the efficiency of the army, right? And NATO improves the efficiency. So it's not just about the alliance, it's not just about the 5th article of the NATO Charter that means that United States will intervene. It's also about this constant work of bringing the armies to the NATO standards, right? So, and then this becomes a kind of slippery slope, because if we agree to all these points in NATO, then what is exactly the leftist policy here? So just to accept the existence of NATO as a leftist force, or to have some kind of limitation on NATO, to have some kind of internal reform of NATO, and so on. So in that sense, it's actually a very difficult question. And I think that Zofia already had a lot of valid points, a lot of work done on this. But I think that even more work needs to be done to think about this, because it is quite dangerous when we start with, you start from accepting NATO tactically, which is perfectly understandable, and then you end up just agreeing to all those internal structures of NATO that exist. And so then what is left of internationalism, for instance? And so yeah, there's really a lot to think about.
Thank you. We have really a lot of interventions and questions, but unfortunately we have only 3 minutes left. I would just say that we received greetings from Jin Young Kim from a leftist organization in South Korea, PSSP, who says that they support the Ukrainian left. We have some comments that you can read in the chat that are not exactly questions. And we have a large question about the role of the UN and the possibility of its continuing relevance, which I think we can't really finish today. So, yes, Gilbert?
Yeah, a quick comment to add at the end. Two things. First, NATO is basically an alliance of one overlord, a suzerain, and vassals. The overlord is the United States of America. The vassals are the European countries. That's what NATO is. And one can think, for instance, of defense, whatever it is, research, coordination at the European level, not depending on the United States, because the United States is now pushing Europe in a very dangerous direction, which is turning NATO. That's a new step in the transformation of NATO into including China, not only Russia, but China as a target of NATO. The last NATO summit, for the first time, pointed to China as in some way the opponent or the enemy. This is extremely dangerous. And the United States, Ilya spoke of that, the United States has been taking an aggressive stance towards China, just stoking fire in the relation on the issue of Taiwan, which leads China in its turn to react aggressively. And that's also something to be condemned. But this is a very dangerous thing. So that's why there is an alternative to NATO. There should be an alternative to NATO. And that should start by refusing U.S. sovereignty over Europe, which led to, just take the occupation of Iraq, for instance. That was some key European countries opposed that, but they could not do anything. France and Germany were against this, and yet the United States was able to draw other countries into this terrible tragedy that the occupation of Iraq was. So
Thank
this
you,
is
thank you, Gilbert. Gilbert, unfortunately, we have to finish here. I have to say, yeah, I have to express my gratitude to our audience, who was very engaged and active. And I personally have to say that all of the issues, all of the problems raised here are definitely central to elaborating our internationalist point of view, and we'll keep it in mind in our future discussions and the materials that we will commission and write for Commons. So again, thank you very much, and I wish you peaceful evening, and yeah, good luck to everyone.